Baalbek, which is located in Lebanon, that is evidence of a lost ancient advanced civilization.
Massive stones bigger than buses, lifted with precision that modern cranes can't match. At Baalbek in Lebanon, blocks weighing over 1,000 tons sit stacked as if gravity itself bowed to the builders. For centuries, no record explained who did it or how. The Romans stayed silent. Legends spoke of giants.
And Baalbek has the largest stones that were ever quarried in human history, the largest stones that were lifted, stacked, and transported in human history.
Gods and powers beyond human reach. But now, new evidence points to an answer that changes everything. Could this site finally reveal the truth behind history's most unshakable mystery? The stones that shouldn't exist. At Baalbek, the first thing that seizes your imagination isn't the Roman columns or the grand temple ruins, it's the foundation stones. Monsters in limestone that shouldn't even exist. Standing at the base of the site, you see 3 slabs so enormous they look less like blocks cut by human hands and more like chunks of earth itself forced into order. Together, they form what's called the trilithon. Each trilithon stone measures about 62 to 66 feet or 19 to 20 meters long, 14 feet or 4.3 meters high, and 12 feet or 3.6 meters deep. Each weighs roughly 750 to 800 tons. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than 120 fully loaded school buses or nearly 3 Boeing 747s balanced in one block of stone. And yet, these slabs aren't resting quietly on the ground. They're suspended 23 feet in the air, fitted so tightly that not even a blade of grass or a sheet of paper can slide into their seams. For engineers and archaeologists, these stones immediately spark a question: how? Even today, with hydraulic cranes, heavy haulers, and cutting-edge construction, moving blocks this size would be nearly impossible. The heaviest stone ever successfully transported with modern equipment weighs around 340 tons, barely a third of Baalbek's giants. NASA's massive cranes, capable of assembling rockets, could only lift a fraction of their weight. Yet somehow, thousands of years ago, without diesel engines or steel cables, people not only quarried and moved them, but raised them into place with surgical precision. And now comes the turning of events, when the dark and deep mystery unfolds. Normally, civilizations would celebrate with great pomp and joy, acts usually involving grand construction. Ancient Egypt boasted of the pyramids and carved hieroglyphic records detailing the construction of the pyramids. The Romans, in particular, took great pride in and meticulously recorded every aqueduct, every amphitheater, and every triumph of great engineering. But here at Baalbek, called Heliopolis by the Romans, their records are incriminated by silence.
A work of the Romans. Now, the Romans built on top of the megalithic constructions of Baalbek.
Not a mention of the trilithon, no diagrams, no inscriptions on the monuments themselves, displaying great pride in the accomplishment. Deafening silence indeed. For a culture obsessed with reputation, a most unsettling notion arises from this silence. Perhaps the Romans did not record the positioning of the trilithon because they were not its builders. Perhaps it was simply there when they arrived, and the massive blocks were already in situ when the Romans came. If this were so, the key marvel of Baalbek had not been made by the Romans, but rather upon it. This would mean the trilithon is far older than the temples that rise above it, a remnant achievement of a civilization far too ancient to slip completely from record. This gap in history leaves much to be conjectured. Were these stones made by the Phoenicians, worshipping at Baalbek long before the advent of Rome? Or were even those who understood engineering able to work with such stubborn stone further back in the Neolithic period, when humanity ought to have been without organizational powers to even think about such gigantic projects? These unproven propositions generate even more exotic theories. 2 lost civilizations, forgotten techniques, and maybe something anti-human. But even without inviting speculation, the bare facts are enough to shock. 3 stones, each so heavy as to dwarf the efforts of modernity, are positioned with millimetric precision nearly 2 stories above the ground. No matter who built them or how, the trilithon basically mocks everything we feel we know about the capabilities of ancient builders. If the Romans didn't leave the answer in writing, maybe the quarry, the birthplace of these giants, still holds the clues. The Quarry of Giants.
At Baalbek, the most famous feature of this quarry is the stone of the pregnant woman.
Half a mile from the Baalbek temple complex, the mystery deepens. In a dusty quarry on the edge of town lies the birthplace of the megaliths, the very spot where the ancients carved their monsters out of living rock. If the trilithon blocks already seem impossible, the stones abandoned here take the puzzle into an entirely new league. The most famous is the Stone of the Pregnant Woman. Measuring over 20 meters long and weighing nearly 1,000 tons, it lies partly buried in the ground, tilted at an angle as if frozen mid-lift. Local legend claims a pregnant woman tricked villagers into feeding her by promising she alone knew the secret to moving such massive blocks. Touching the stone, some say, even brings fertility blessings. These folk tales may sound whimsical, but they show how deeply the mystery of Baalbek has lived in local memory. Generations have struggled to explain what rational history cannot, but the pregnant woman is just the beginning.
Are the Baalbek stones, which are 6 massive Roman monoliths, including the pregnant woman.
In the 1990s, researchers uncovered another block nearby, the Stone of the South. At roughly 1,200 tons, it eclipses the trilithon stones themselves. And then came an even more staggering discovery in 2014, the Forgotten Stone, weighing around 1,500 tons, the largest building block ever quarried by human hands. To this day, it remains in situ, partly buried, as if the builders started something they couldn't finish. In fact, why were such giants left like that? One explanation would be very practical. After realizing cracks in the rock or uneven ground would have made blocks unstable, the builders simply left them.
Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand.
Perhaps with the idea that they would then have needed to use them, but never finished the project, either because of changed power structures and politics, or simply because of the limitations of manpower. The truth remains. There are stones larger than those placed into walls at Baalbek right here in this quarry. Those are proof that whoever carved these stones was reaching for something much more amazing still. If you look hard enough at the quarry stones, you will find signs of human hands. There are chisel markings and scars on the surfaces to prove that such blocks were not indeed accidents of geology. They were deliberately made, their lines straight and measured. Researchers studying the cuts discovered a clever technique, chiseling along natural fissures in the limestone. Exploiting the rock's weaknesses meant that it could be split out into enormous slabs with no shattering, resourceful but dangerous, like cutting glass on an enormous scale. Yet here indeed lies the conundrum for the quarries. Had they been productions of imagination, Baalbek's stones could at least be idle forms, such that we would scarcely anticipate finding their incomplete brethren sleeping in the adjacent vicinity. Yet here they are, plainly visible, abandoned mid-process. The quarry is the missing link from raw bedrock to monumental trilithon, with reference to intent, method, and indeed proves that human-bodied beings, be they Romans or Phoenicians, or even earlier attempts to carve, shape and maneuver blocks of unimaginable size. Not every question, of course, is answered at the quarry. It explains not how a 1,500-ton stone can be moved uphill and set 2 stories high, but does tell us that these builders were neither afraid of scale, nor could they reach for the impossible and go farther than we ever expected. Legends can entertain us, but the real evidence lies in what archaeologists have dug up beneath Baalbek's temples: blueprints, layers, and a timeline that rewrites history. Layers of time. Beneath Baalbek. If the trilithon and the quarry giants leave us baffled, archaeology has been steadily peeling back the layers at Baalbek to reveal something just as astonishing.
And Baalbek has the largest stones that were ever quarried in human history, the largest stones that were lifted, stacked, and transported in human history.
The site itself is far older, far more complex, and far more carefully planned than most people realize. What looks like a Roman masterpiece turns out to be a palimpsest, a layered history that stretches thousands of years deeper than Rome. The story of modern investigation begins in 1898, when Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany visited Baalbek. His fascination sparked the first serious digs, which ran into the early 1990s. What those excavations uncovered changed everything. Beneath the grand Roman temples, researchers found artifacts that reached back to the Neolithic period, nearly 10,000 years ago. This wasn't just a Roman site, it was a hilltop settlement with a sacred presence that predated the empire by millennia. Every civilization that came later, from the Phoenicians to Alexander to Augustus, was building on top of something much older. That discovery alone explains one of Baalbek's strangest mysteries: the Romans' silence. If the foundation blocks were already in place when they arrived, there was nothing to brag about. They built their dazzling temples on top of a platform whose origins were already lost to time. Rome inherited, but did not invent, Baalbek's greatest marvel. The digs also uncovered something that stunned even seasoned archaeologists: blueprints carved directly into stone floors. These weren't crude sketches, they were precise floor plans etched at scale, showing layouts of courtyards and temple sections. Imagine walking across a massive courtyard and realizing you're literally stepping on the architect's design drawings. It was proof of master planning on a scale that demanded extraordinary organization and foresight. The builders weren't just stacking stone, they were executing calculated designs with exacting detail. Then came the very last and the greatest shock. The construction techniques used in the Baalbek podium, the massive foundation which underpinned the Temple of Jupiter, matched perfectly with Herodian architecture in Jerusalem. The stones shared the same drafted margins, the same alternating headers and stretchers, and of course, the same average course height of about 3.6 feet. They were not vague similarities. They were precise signatures of a building tradition. Either the same crews did it, or at least shared knowledge networks were active at both places. This meant suddenly that Baalbek was not an isolated anomaly at all. Rather, it was part of a greater web of ancient engineering excellence. In fact, pottery fragments found in such later excavations only added depth. Some had cuneiform grammar, making activities Persian in the long time predating the Romans. Bit by bit, Baalbek turned from being seen as a singular Romanized project to that of a sacred construction site, repeatedly reinvented and expanded by whoever happened to exercise control in the region. Each civilization left its mark, but only in testimony to the fact that it was unable to displace the greatest stones. The timeline now wraps into a bitter coil whenever it is called for an easy answer. Baalbek was not constructed in the time frame of a particular culture. It was a relay project that spread across thousands of years. First Neolithic settlers, then Phoenician worshippers, then Persians, then Romans, each inheriting the foundations of the last. And then, through it all, were Trellithon blocks, which in themselves were so ancient and so inexplicable that later builders may have treated them as sacred relics in themselves. Yet this creates a seeming paradox for modern researchers. As the revelations come, thus more explicit in the digging, it becomes which definitely shows Baalbek is no accident of myth. Yet again, it makes it clear that no single culture in recorded history left a convincing blueprint for how the megaliths were moved. If planning and layered history prove the stones were intentional, then the next question is brutal. Could sheer human power really make the impossible happen? Breaking the impossible. For centuries, Baalbek's megaliths have been called impossible. Too heavy, too tall, too precise, beyond the reach of human hands. But what if impossible really just means incredibly difficult? When archaeologists and engineers put the theories to the test, they discovered that while the problem is daunting, it may not require aliens or lost super technology, just ingenuity, manpower, and brutal persistence. The most obvious explanation is the one we picture instinctively: wooden rollers and ramps. Place the massive stones on logs, roll them across flat ground, then drag them up an incline. On paper, it looks like simple physics. In practice, it falls apart. Experiments with much smaller blocks showed that rollers slip sideways on slopes, the logs snap under the weight, and once the stone tilts even slightly, it becomes uncontrollable. Scaling that up to 900 or 1,200 tons would be a disaster. That's why some scholars turned to the Romans' known machinery. Rome's cranes were brilliant. Simple pulleys evolving into heavy-duty polyspastos rigs, capable of lifting loads many times what a single worker could manage. With tread wheels, teams of men could lift to 6 to 7 tons, a staggering feat for the time. But even their most advanced lifting towers maxed out at 50 to 60 tons. That's impressive, but it's still less than 1/10 the weight of Baalbek's foundation stones. Even if you combined multiple cranes, the math simply doesn't stretch to 800 tons or more. And besides rollers and cranes, what else could be possibly utilized? Techniques such as sledges, capstans, soil ramps, and sheer numbers left imprisoned from the spotlight might offer part of the solution. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that large stones can be pulled along prepared tracks, especially when the ground surface is lubricated with water, clay, or animal fat, thereby reducing surface friction. Roped teams working with capstans could have applied astonishing force to inch forward the very heavy tons of the stone block set to be placed. You can also throw in earthen causeways that were clad under the rising structure. Thereby a plausible theory comes about for sliding the stones into position rather than lifting them. Really, it is all about patience. We think of ancient builders racing against time. The truth is, however, they might spend months preparing the path for a single stone or simply building the embankments up to the desired level. Instead of hurrying cranes that could lift 900 tons at once, the procedure might have been a painfully slow crawl inch by inch at a time, day by day, with workers constantly shoring up the ground below. Think less miracle lift and more endless shove. What baffles is the point of using such colossal stones in the first place. Smaller blocks would have been much easier, faster, and less risky to work with. Some historians argue it was all about prestige, building at a scale to make one's rivals gasp. Others see practical wisdom. Fewer joints result in greater stability, especially against earthquakes. A foundation of monster blocks would withstand centuries of tremors, ensuring the site remained the center of the sacred. Thus, size had purpose. It was insurance. This doesn't ring hollow. Rather, it asserts how very determined, organized, and ambitious these ancient builders were. What seems impossible now might just have been possible, albeit only at a cost of labor so staggering and coordination so unrelenting that we can hardly keep up with it today. But even if the methods make sense, one riddle remains. Who exactly marshaled that effort? And why did Rome stay silent? The builders' history forgot. Baalbek's stones are real. The quarry shows intent. The blueprints prove planning. And experiments suggest that with enough workers and time, moving the megaliths wasn't magic. It was human determination. Yet, one question refuses to go away. Who actually built them? And why did the Romans, the great record keepers of their age, say nothing about the largest blocks ever set into place? The layered timeline offers some clues. Archaeology tells us the site's occupation stretches back more than 10,000 years. Neolithic settlers treated the hilltop as sacred. The Phoenicians, centuries later, built temples to Baal, the sky god who gave Baalbek its name. The Persians left pottery and artifacts. By the time Rome arrived, the place already carried the weight of sacred history. Each civilization reused and expanded the site, but none carved its origin story in stone. This continuity makes one possibility very likely. The Trilithon and its foundation blocks predate Rome, when Augustus and his successors built their dazzling temples at Heliopolis. They may have inherited a platform already standing for centuries. That would explain the silence. The Romans bragged about what they built, not what they inherited. To claim the Trilithon as theirs would have been dishonest, or perhaps even blasphemous if they saw the platform as sacred ground left by older builders. So, if not Rome, who? Some point to the Phoenicians, masters of maritime trade and stone construction whose influence spread across the Mediterranean. They had the religious motive and the organizational ability to attempt colossal projects. Others argue for the Persians, who left traces on the site and had an empire capable of mobilizing massive labor. Still others believe the earliest phases go all the way back to the Neolithic builders, a culture with sacred intent but no written records, leaving behind only mystery. But none of these candidates leaves a perfect fit. The Phoenicians built in massive styles, but nowhere else did they move stones approaching 1,000 tons. The Persians engineered palaces and terraces, yet their stonework never approached this scale. The Neolithic people had neither wheels nor metal tools, and they had not invented writing. Every option raises more questions than it gives answers. That's the reason why alternative theories keep on drawing Baalbek. Some believe that there once existed civilizations that had knowledge and then lost it. Others propose the ancient alien theory, arguing that only advanced technology can account for stones of such immense size. While the drama runs high in these scenarios, they lose dimension by leaving out human tool marks, quarry traces, and construction blueprints. The truth may be less glamorous, but certainly not less extraordinary. Determined human societies over centuries pooling labor and innovation to achieve what to us today looks impossible. At least that is quite possibly at the root of the silence. The Romans seem not to have felt the need to explain what they did not do. They luxuriated in their accomplishments. The soaring columns of the Temple of Jupiter, the ornate reliefs of the Temple of Bacchus, while leaving the older, heavier foundation blocks an unsolved legacy. To them, the Trilithon may have been less a triumph than a riddle even in their own time. Names of the builders might, in the end, remain hidden, but their message is recorded in stone: limitless ambition, visions beyond tools, and the audacity to make the earth bend. Which part of Baalbek struck you most? The quarry giants, the floor blueprints, or the silence in the records? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, like the video, subscribe for more ancient investigations, and watch the next video on your screen for another mystery that finally makes sense.